Welcome to Phoenix Rising with Dr. Z. This podcast is all about conversations about healing and rising from the ashes of your grief and trauma. In this podcast, we will be deconstructing and highlighting the different aspects of grief and loss. I'm your host, Dr. Christina Zampatella.
Right.
So mindfulness would be a really helpful skill for somebody who is learning to navigate their grief in general. But when we're talking about bereaved parents, could really be a powerful technique. So what might be some ways where people can learn mindfulness?
Teaching mindfulness practices, and there are courses online you can find by him, videos for free out there as well. There are plenty of apps that people can use, right? Calm, Headspace, Insight Timer. There are also, Headspace has a series on Netflix, the Guide to Meditation.
I did not know that.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Fantastic series.
Duly noted.
8 episodes, or about 20 minutes
Really?
apiece. Yeah. Each one's about a different practice of mindfulness. The first half of it or so, it's broken down in really ways just digestible. And then the second half is a guided practice.
That is really cool.
Yeah. There are so many benefits to mindfulness, and it's not something that's a cure-all. It's not something to cure anything, but it is a practice and a way of approaching life that can help people to move in one way. One way it can be helpful is for people who are grieving to move through their grief mindfully.
Right. And it doesn't have to be, I'm sitting here on this cushion and doing this and Om and all of that. You can be mindful taking a shower.
Right.
You do not have to do anything formal.
Yeah.
There's meditation.
Sure.
And then mindfulness. And then so the mindfulness is, and when I was talking about the shower, it's like, when was the last time you were in the shower and literally just focused on feeling the water or smelling the soap?
Right.
Or without being at work in your head, or what I'm going to do when I get out of here, or I better hurry up, or whatever, just to be in that moment at that time. I think, and tell me what your thoughts are on this. When we are grieving, being in the present moment, is terrifying in some ways, is extremely painful. We ruminate over what we have lost. We may reflect on what we have lost. We're anxious about the potential futures that we have lost.
Right.
So, I mean, would you say that mindfulness, it's not just like a coping skill?
No.
How else does that help? How does that help?
Yeah. Mindfulness, to call it a skill makes it sound kind of mundane.
Yeah.
Right? It doesn't really do it justice.
Right.
That's why the one way I refer to it as a way of approaching life. And I think that's maybe an important part of this, right? What you just mentioned, meditation is what's often referred to as the formal practice of mindfulness.
Right.
But mindfulness, the greatest benefit is how it affects the rest of your day, your entire life, not just those however many minutes you're sitting on the cushion or in a chair or on the floor. And it's about, not about changing how you feel. It's about changing your relationship with your experience. So that we can, like you said, it can be terrifying because, to be present with your pain because it's incredibly painful, right? But practicing mindfulness can help us to be present with that pain and not experience the same kind of suffering.
Not get swallowed by it.
Exactly. Right. There's so many metaphors out there about describing that, but one that's always stuck with me is it's you're not drowning in the storm. You're learning to ride the waves.
Oh, I like that. This might be a hard question. You might be like, I can't believe you're asking this question. I'm going to ask it anyway because you know me. When we're looking at like narrative reconstruction, and we're going to talk in another episode, we're going to talk about the different kind of theories associated with grief and grieving process, because we know there's no 5 stages of grief.
Right.
I want to say that in every single episode.
Let's hammer that home.
We're going to hammer that home. Everybody to know. I have lots of curse words I could say, so I'm not going to do it. But when we start thinking about trying to integrate loss into the narrative of our lives, and you have one that is so disorganizing, and one that has shattered the narrative, I mean, in every way possible. People talk about, making sense
Mm-hmm.
of what you've gone through,
Mm-hmm.
finding benefit
Mm-hmm.
in what you've gone through,
Mm-hmm.
and the shift in identity.
Mm-hmm.
And those three things over time needing to happen in order to truly integrate. Do you think you can find benefit in the loss of a child?
Mm.
I know. Sorry. I
That's
told you.
all
I
right.
warned you.
You did warn
Sorry.
me. That's a big,
That's a huge question.
Like, how do you,
and like, what do we mean by that?
how is it possible
Yeah.
to find benefit?
Right.
So do I think it's possible? Yes. That's the short answer. I think it's about finding the ways that that loss impacts your life as time moves forward and as you continue to move through your grief in meaningful ways. One example, all right, that I could throw. Let me know if this kind of sounds, if this makes sense.
Okay.
I know a couple who lost their daughter, teenage daughter, at 17 to cancer. And something that she said to them or expressed was that she wished that there was a camp or a place where kids with cancer could just be kids, right? Mm-hmm. To have a break or reprieve from, just all of the pain and the difficulties of being in the hospitals and the clinics and the treatments and everything. Mm-hmm. These parents started an oncology camp for kids with cancer to have 1 week a year where they can just get away and not worry about all that stuff. They can just be kids. Mm-hmm. And it's an act of service. It's grown into this amazing organization mm-hmm. that never would have existed mm-hmm. had they not experienced that loss.
That's something I know I'm interrupting.
No, that's okay.
But you literally just said what I was curious about
mm-hmm.
was this never would have happened
right.
unless this happened.
Right.
I would take everything back.
Exactly.
Everything back to mm-hmm. not have to not be in a place where right. I did this. But the reality is I've lost my child mm-hmm. and it makes no sense to me. And so in time, is there something I can do with my suffering mm-hmm. that allows it to be bittersweet mm-hmm. so that I can say it's not in vain? But it can take a long time to get
yes.
there. So
yes.
is that what we're talking about when
yeah.
you say, being able to have a purpose that you find mm-hmm. in the suffering that you have?
Yes.
And the loss of your time.
Absolutely. And just like you said, it can take time, and there is no concrete timeline there. Right. And like you said, I would take it all back.
Absolutely.
If I could. Right? It doesn't discount the loss at all.
Right.
Right. It's an and. I've experienced this tremendous loss, and I have now, because of that, mm-hmm. Found whatever this meaningful endeavor is in my life.
I'm thinking about like Mothers Against Drunk Driving too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Just being able to take something that's so senseless. Mm-hmm. And you also said something important here too, and I know I'm kind of taking you the scenic route, but
it's okay.
You should know enough about
Let's
me
just
now.
enjoy the view.
It's like we're just come along with the ride. Here we go. The timeline thing. Mm-hmm. I'm going to be talking about prolonged grief disorder mm-hmm. later on mm-hmm. in another podcast. But this is important to note too, right? Because some people do get stuck. Yes. I've seen people stuck for 30 mm-hmm. years mm-hmm. and I'm talking stuck, like not just literally not functioning at all, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of research around how long is enough time to grieve. Mm-hmm. And, what are some indicators that grief has become stuck? And there's this thing about not wanting to take the grieving process and make it look like an illness mm-hmm. because it's taking quote unquote so long, whatever the hell that means, mm-hmm. so long. But also being aware that there's a fine line where mm-hmm. people begin to suffer and there might be an indicator there that they're going to continue to suffer in such ways that they're non-functioning. Mm-hmm. But I don't know about you, but for me, when I start thinking about the loss of a child, mm-hmm. we need to have more grace around when we start talking about being stuck.
Right.
Like seriously. Like, so for example, if you saw a parent, if you went into a home and you saw that the child's bedroom was still intact and this was a year later, what would your thoughts be about that?
What would my thoughts be about that?
What would your thoughts be about that? Room's still intact. Everything just the way it was before they died. It's a year later. I'm asking you this because I get asked this question all the time, and I'm like, what? Okay, so I'm curious.
It's a year later.
It's a year later.
Yeah. I agree with your statement that we need more grace.
Yeah.
You know, with the loss of a child, that may not be an indicator necessarily of being stuck or being in prolonged grief disorder.
Right.
Right. And I'm sure not going to tell a parent when they should be ready. Right. To change that room. Right. Maybe right now that's what they need.
Maybe it is.
You know, the criteria for the prolonged grief disorder, right? At least a year. Yeah. Right. But with parents,
exactly
that timeline. How are you going to put an exact timeline on that?
And when you say the 1 year mark, we're talking about what mental health professionals use in order to diagnose people with certain disorders. So this is called the DSM, Diagnostic Statistical Manual. And the prolonged grief disorder is a disorder that was just added to the very newest DSM that came out. Interestingly enough, though, the DSM is used here in the United States. You've got the ICD, which is the International Classification System of Disorders, and they say 6 months.
Right.
Okay, so what the rest of the world is saying, yep, 6 months, and we're saying a year, and it's like, is this arbitrary? This is where it comes down to really needing somebody who specializes in grief. And especially when we're starting to look at things like more complicated types of loss. There's one thing to companion somebody along the process of grief as a mental health professional, but it's another one who has the experience and the training to be able to see, okay, we're getting way off track, but to have the nuanced awareness that just because the book says a year, this person lost their child. I am not going to drop them into this category just because it's been a year. Right. Because as a person who specializes, as a thanatologist who specializes, you have more awareness of not shoving that person into a box. But then you also have the awareness of, all right, we are not moving in any way at all. And they are really stuck in this kind of maladaptive functioning where, you know, they're just not functioning at all. Right. So I think this is an example, working with bereaved parents is an example of one of the greatest, unfortunately, opportunities for mental health professionals to get it wrong.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah.
Especially because it's a new diagnosis. And I was talking to somebody else about this. I didn't have a required course in grief.
I didn't either.
I took an elective because I was interested in it. But every single mental health professional who has ever worked with clients have worked with bereaved and or traumatized people. Every single one. And there are a handful of schools, graduate schools, that require a course in death, loss, and grief. So every single person who walks in, either you're going through it now or you've gone through it in the past.
Yeah, absolutely.
And sometimes when you do a good assessment, you can see in the past, that was when things went awry. But yet I've never had a class on, and I'm still running around with the Kubler-Ross 5-stage model. I mean, are we kidding? So, you know, I don't know. I had classes on assessment, like intellectual assessment. Now, I happen to have done those, and that was important. But I've got a lot of colleagues that never did it. But that was a required course. Right. How is this not a required course?
How is this not? Because everyone experiences loss.
Everybody.
In their life.
Doesn't it blows my mind? I have said this before. It pisses me off to the highest of pistivity. Like, it does. Yeah. Like, are you kidding? I don't understand. And I'm a professor. You should hear me yelling at the staff. Being like, what are you talking about? You don't have this class. Yeah. So, anyway, I know I got a little off track there, but I mean, it's important for people to realize this who are bereft parents, because if they are going to a mental health professional, it may be really important for them to be able to say, wait a minute, this doesn't feel right.
Right.
Like, I don't know if this clinician gets it. Not because the clinician doesn't want to get it. Not because they don't think it's important or they're not picking up on the pain. They just might not have the background to deal with loss when it's become extremely complicated. And this is one of those losses that has that risk more than almost any other loss.
Right. Right. And and so that's a place where, as a clinician, as a therapist, we're looking at, has there been an acceptance of that reality yet? If you're thinking someone may be stuck and there's no movement. Right. Now with parents, like we said, with that year, let's use a little bit more tact than just this cookie cutter.
Right.
A year, it's, you know what I mean? But yeah, that acceptance of the reality, right? Not acceptance of the loss of, it's okay that this happened.
Right. The reality of that the loss has happened.
Yeah. We're not shoving this down and not feeling the feelings and, just ignoring the grief, right? That's where people get stuck.
Right.
Yeah.
We run into, as clinicians, you know how I feel about insurance companies. So, and I'm allowed to talk about them because I don't like insurance companies. It's terrible what they do. They will not provide services for people in uncomplicated grief. They will not pay for services for people in uncomplicated grief. They will only wait until it becomes what would be considered a mental illness, quote unquote, mental illness.
Right.
So we cannot, the individuals who don't have the resources to pay out of pocket for a bereavement specialist are then going to have to be either pathologized along the way. Right. You've got an adjustment disorder.
Right. What diagnosis can we slap on here and pathologize something that's not?
So we can get your insurance company to pay for it, which is unethical. You can't do that. And then, but yet you have to. So I guess what I'm saying is, in hopes that this podcast would reach people who can understand this. How do we help people who don't have the resources to pay out of pocket for uncomplicated grief facilitation? Because I'm facilitating your grieving process.
Right.
I'm not grabbing your hand and dragging you through your grieving process. I'm walking next to you. Your unique kind of fingerprint analogy of this is your grief.
Right.
What can somebody do to have somebody walk next to them that isn't pathologizing their grieving process? Does that question make sense?
It does.
Sorry? Okay.
Yeah. But honestly, I don't know if there's an answer with the way, without getting on a soapbox, with the way the system is, with the way that it's structured.
I agree.
Yeah.
So they have to look for resources that might be available to them. So maybe like maybe one thing, they may not have individual opportunities, but maybe they have group opportunities where maybe financially there is some support.
Right.
So that might be an option.
Yeah. So group is a great option if it's something that someone's ready for, because financially speaking, it's a lower cost than individual therapy. Right. But you're still able to get support at a rate that may be more affordable to you. Or going to a support group, right? Also, it could be a great resource. There's plenty out there that are free.
There are some websites as well and Facebook groups.
Right.
Now that comes with a little caveat. You got to be careful because you could get sucked down into the spiral of non-helpful information.
Sure.
And conversations with people that you can get lost in and perhaps are reinforcing maladaptive behaviors. But then again, you may find a whole bunch of people in there that get it. And at least you have some support there as well. I think, tell me if I'm wrong, but finding good books and videos and anything you can do to, these are just options in case you don't have the resources.
Absolutely. Podcasts.
Yeah, podcasts.
Blogs.
Exactly. This specific podcast. Phoenix Rising. So, so I think, being able to reach out to those supports or to find clinicians who really do specialize in grief, who work on a sliding fee scale.
Right.
And that's hard to find anyway. But don't let somebody tell you that you've got a mental illness when you're grieving. You know what I mean?
Right.
You're not having a problem adjusting. You're grieving.
You're grieving. It is a
and you
natural
are just
process. It's a
and
natural
it's
process that
and it's
happens as a
not
result of a
linear.
loss.
Exactly, it's messy. It's not linear,
Mm-hmm.
and it organically will unfold. I mean, we know that anywhere from about 10 to 15% of people will get really, really jammed up in their grief.
Mm-hmm.
But the majority of people get through their grief organically because it's a
Mm-hmm.
natural process.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't want to walk into, professionals who stick them in that 10 to 15%.
Right.
So
Mm-hmm.
anything else before we wrap up today, you think? And it's a huge topic.
It is a big
But can you
topic.
think of anything else that would be important that we're not talking about today yet?
I think one thing we haven't mentioned as much yet is continuing bonds with with the child.
And we're going to be talking about continuing bonds in another podcast.
Okay.
But no, mention it, please, by all means.
Sure. What we've been talking a lot about, remembering, right? Not wanting to forget and continuing to talk about, right? A lost loved one, a lost child. And so the intention as you move through your grief is which I'm sure you'll talk about more in the future, but not to move on, but to move forward and to carry your loved one with you in a new way. And continuing that bond is a part of that journey and that process. So there are a number of ways that a parent could do that. One way would be, through ritual, right? Through use of a ritual, which it provides a container. And I'm not going to sit here and preach to you about ritual. Like you're the expert on that. But it has a beginning and an end and an intention, and it gives someone the space, right, to carry out that intention in a meaningful way. So maybe on my child's birthday, I do something to remember and honor them. Right? There's one way that I could continue that bond. Another could be what we call correspondence with the deceased, right? Continuing the conversation. So it could be letter writing. It could also be talking out loud. If this is something that you identify with spiritually, it could be through prayer. But it's a continuing of the conversation with your child. It's never meant to be a final goodbye. It's a hello again. Let's pick back up again.
I like the way you said that. It's not a final goodbye. It's a hello again.
It's a hello again.
And there's a huge cultural component to this too, because
right.
there's some cultures that are like, nope, there's no continued bond. And we have to be careful not to assume that the client feels there should be a continued bond, or is from a culture that normally wouldn't maintain a continued bond, but maybe that client is now butting up against their own culture and is struggling with that. And then there becomes like a cultural identity kind of issue that ends up popping up too. So we can't like make assumptions one way or another.
Right, exactly. And so we want to be cognizant and sensitive to people's cultural practices and expectations as well. But if it is culturally appropriate, continuing that bond, finding meaningful ways to do that can be a great practice in your grieving process. One more I'll mention, or I'll say a question that I ask clients oftentimes when we're talking about this is, what connected you in life? Like, what did you do, or what did you share with each other that gave you that bond and connection, and how can you continue that now?
Oh, I love that.
Right? Yeah. Like maybe you always baked these cookies right this time of year or something, and you continue to do that, or maybe you enjoyed doing a certain activity, outdoor activity, and you keep doing that. Maybe you were working on a creative project together, and I've seen parents struggle to continue that without their child, and then at some point, if and when they felt ready, finishing that project. They were working on a car together, rebuilding this car. And then dad finishing this car and taking it out for a drive was so cathartic for him, right? And helped him to feel connected to his son, right? Things like that. What connected you in life, and how can you continue that now moving forward?
Oh, I think that's really important for people to be able to hear that. I am so appreciative that you came in and talked about this, and you know this, I am so thankful that you continue to run this group, because they're at least in our area, there just is no therapy group that's doing this.
Right.
So thank you for all the work that you do, but thank you for joining me today and talking about such an important topic. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome, and thanks again for having me.
Absolutely.
Thank you for listening to Phoenix Rising with Dr. Z. If you found this podcast helpful, please share it, subscribe, and leave a rating or review wherever you get your podcasts. We want to be a resource for anyone who's experiencing loss, and this is a simple way you can help us spread the word. Check out our show description. There you'll find a link to connect with me on social media, as well as helpful articles and resources.